And it begins to answer that question, how do we continue this presence of Christ, the spiritual reality? Ask yourself in terms of the movement you're a part of. When did it start? And is it still alive and on fire spiritually 4 generations later? That same question is what the early church dealt with, and the Desert Fathers, the monastic movement, was one of the answers to that issue. My third point this morning there is the 3 streams in the desert that express the tensions of different perspectives in east and western regions of the church. Now, this gets fairly complicated. As you read Vellamati and other books on Christology, as you're writing your papers, you realize that one time you can be friends with someone, and after a while, a friend becomes a heretic or you become a heretic. It sort of becomes an interesting whole dance, doesn't it, theologically? The politics, the theology, and this is fairly primordial as the church is developing an understanding of Christ and of ecclesiology and how it relates to these different components. It's interesting to watch who is labeled a heretic, yet their influence lives on today in the church. As I looked at these, I read Vellamati along with you, and I'm going to refer to my primary sources there. I encourage you to, at some point, pick up Colin Green's book on Christology and Cultural Perspective. The desert and wilderness have impacted my life, and in trying to understand what the liberation theologians are telling us. Probably an overstatement. Some of you have heard me say it before. Tell me your address, and I'll tell you your theology. Think about it. Might be an overstatement, but yet I think there's some value in that. And that's why I'm having you look back at your own addresses you have lived in, because we are not going to stay in a static position theologically. We tend to develop, if you want to call it drift, or develop a progress through our life. We don't stay at one position because we're impacted by the forces, the trends, the streams around us, the people we interact with. You see that in the life of the early church fathers as well as in our own life. Just look in the mirror. As I looked at the early church fathers, I see 3 streams that emerge out of this. And again, this does not quite fit where Vellamati is coming from. This is where I'm coming from. And this is going to be sort of a formational Christology for you this morning. The first one is a cosmic Christology expressed in poetry. Person we don't spend much time on, Ephraim, there, the Syrian. We call this kind of theology apopathic, A-P-O-P-A-T-H-I-C. This is spirituality that expresses the mystery of God in order to experience God in silence. Joel read this morning for us from the Psalms. The Psalms are poetry. They are prayers. They are hymns. But they're basically the response of the heart to God's action, to salvation, to redemption, to the grief we are experiencing, the different struggles, and we respond to God. That would be Ephraim's forte. His gifting here, Ephraim is a poet, and apparently he did know it. It's okay. Some of his chroniclers say that maybe he wrote 3 million lines of poetry. I try to figure out when did he have all the time to do that, but I guess because he wasn't, on the tube or on the internet or watching NFL, they had time to write poetry. That's a lot of lines of poetry, isn't it? I was trying to just fathom that. 3 million lines of poetry. They think is one of the greatest poets that has ever lived. And yet, some of it is lost, but there's some of it remaining. Something to think about, and I have one of his prayers here in the next page. Another way of approaching cosmic Christology is the catopathic, P-H-A-T-I-C. This is spirituality that utilizes words and images to describe God. Here we think now of Origen and theologians. We tend to be more theological in seminaries than we do poetic. Spiritual formation is more poetic than it is theological. Now, it's not divorced or separated from theology, but it is more an expression of the heart. That's why we spend so much time in the Psalms and in prayer. Now, Origen, the theologian, gets in some hot water. But he developed a three-stage schema of spiritual formation: moral, natural, and contemplative. The moral we would call behavioral. The natural we would call intellectual, or theological, I suppose. And then the contemplative was this concept of spiritual union with God, which was the goal of the Eastern Church. Now, probably in your reading, you started getting a little nervous and processing this, what Peter talks about, partakers of the divine nature. Paul talks about a faith union in Romans. Divinization, the whole aspect of recovering the image of God and becoming more like Christ, the transformation on the inside, our heart, our spirit, our life, being transformed, that was the goal of Eastern spirituality. A cosmic Christology, the focus here is about a resurrected and ascended Lord who is the Savior of humanity and the cosmos. This is Christology from above. Now, let's look at the next one, and that is communal Christology expressed in the church. This is Christology among us. Because what I find most of the reading is Christology from above and below, and as an Anabaptist, you know, I got to go among us into community. Basil Caesarea, his gifting was administration. One of the Cappadocian fathers, along with his brother Gregory of Nyssa, no relative, I suppose, and Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory of Nazianzus was a friend, and what's interesting, these three, along with their sister, Macrinia, she gets, I guess, second billing. We talk about desert fathers. We also have desert mothers. There are a few books out there now about the desert mothers, and they were supportive of what the fathers were doing. So Macrina, she later on starts a retreat center and does a lot to help the cause. Again, the people I'm listing here are all, we would think, in the monastic stream, but they didn't necessarily spend their whole life in the desert. They may have had periods of time of living in some kind of monastic sequestered place, but it also was a lifestyle that they lived within the context of village or city. In this communal Christology, the emphasis is living in community, and Basil had two rules or principles to live by: thanksgiving and obedience. And for Basil, like for many of the Eastern folks, spiritual formation is the process of restoring the image of God. Now, this one is sort of interesting how they sort of turn the Greek perspective upside down. Instead of going from darkness to light, his perspective on spiritual growth was going from light to the darkness of God. Okay? Divine darkness, my understanding of that would be an abandonment of the self-will. Sometimes we call this the dark night of the soul. When you let go of the last control, trust structures in yourself and have that abandonment and release to God. This is the mystic union. Basil defended Trinitarian doctrine. And his focus on communal spirituality and Christology impacted the monastic movement till today.